Hello, everyone. My name is Brandon Traffenstedt. I'm an engineer with CyberArk. And in this session, we'll be talking more about the CyberArk technology. So we'll be diving down into the elements of our core platform, things like vaulting, rotation, native access controls, making sure that users don't completely have to change the way they do things in order to leverage the security as part of the platform. Now, this session will be in two parts. We'll, of course, have the general overview showing you kind of how the tech works at the high level. And then my favorite part, we'll show you a demonstration of how the solution works as well, a typical day in the life of a number of different user personas. So, credential vaults, where we're going to put all of our secrets. Once we've discovered them, either programmatically, or we've done it automatically, or integrated with things like CloudWatch and AWS to find new EC2, whatever way we did it, we put the secrets somewhere. So for our user here, Brandon, Bob, Tim, Phil, John, Eva, Bo, Mina, for instance, they need to access CyberArk somehow. Now there's an old school way of doing that and a new school way of doing it. I'll show you both. There's nothing wrong with old school, it's just what's been around the longest. That old school way is for our user here to pop open a web browser. Inside, once they've authenticated to CyberArk, hopefully using strong authentication, you'll see this in the demonstration, they'll have access to all of the credentials they care about based on who they are. Active Directory group membership, LDAP group membership, any LDAP v3 compliant directory is going to work okay here. Doesn't have to be specifically Microsoft AD. But they've got access to a bunch of stuff. And in the most basic of workflows, they check out one of those passwords. Just pull it out. Now that can be placed behind ticketing systems, placed behind internal approval flows, however you want to do it, but they now have access. By managing these secrets though, I can now change them. Right? I can wash those credentials based on a policy that you set. Whether that's super aggressive, like after every use, or a little bit more permissive, every month, 2 months, whatever it may be, we're actually doing changes. Now, the cool part about the rotation is we do it using native protocols. We change passwords just like a human would. And it's because of this we don't use any agents. Agents are bad and gross. And while we do use them in some places and they're not bad and gross there, for the core, I really want to limit the amount of agents I throw out there. I think I've just heard a collective relief, a sigh of relief over the internet there. Maybe it was just my stomach. In any case, we try and steer away from that. But by using a native protocol, for instance, if I'm rotating a root account, I programmatically connect over port 22, run past WD or whatever command I need to. If I'm updating an AWS access key secret key pair, I launch AWS CLI, remove an old access key, regenerate a new one, and then commit it. But by doing it using those native protocols, in addition to not having an agent, it also means that any secret that a person or non-person can rotate, I can bring under management. And while in many cases we've seen them, yes?
I was just going to ask about password rotation. The Federal Trade Commission stated that there's actually more risk exists with rotating passwords frequently versus strong passwords. Mm-hmm. Do you have any opinion? Like, is there research to back that up? From my experience, I know there is issues in people creating the strong passwords because they have to do it so often. Sure. They'll generally just redo the same password or add a one or change it so many times they can go back to the original. But when it comes to like actually having it automated, is there an issue with it changing so often that actually starts to be predictable?
Yeah, excellent question and a very good point. When we're looking at human-generated secrets, if you're anything like me, your corporate policy is to regenerate your password every 2 weeks. There are going to be a lot of exclamation points at the end of that. When we see users who have privileged alternate accounts, Brandon_admin, for instance, a lot of times that's a permutation of my lower level account too. So while there is risk there, when we look at the technical kind of risks of programmatic password generation, what can happen is if we rotate so incredibly often, every 5 minutes, for instance, operating systems will need to keep up. We've got a pool of accounts that also need to be rotated too. So we see more operational risk there and less of the security risk side of things as well. So I think the FTC's guidance was primarily for human-generated stuff, but most of the time, our customers and our recommendations are around either A, by twice a day rotation. For some accounts that may be after every use, but for privileged ones, the powerful ones. But most folks are dealing with regulated rotations. once a month, once every 180 days. But I'll submit to you that even if we're looking at multiple changes, the very best thing to do is just rotate it once. That's all you got to do, just one time.
Well, was it NIST, they said that you should really only rotate it in the event that it has potentially been compromised?
So I can't say I agree with that logic. If we always act, if we've completely 100% validated we've been compromised, it's like going to the dentist only when we know we've had a cavity.
It's only reactive, you want to be more preventive.
But at the very least, that's what you should do.
Yeah.
That's the low end, right? At the very least, you should brush your teeth once a day. You should probably do it more than once and floss too. But I think that the recommendation frameworks are there simply to do that, to provide us something to build upon, some way to improve our security for sure.
And does CyberArk consult their users on how often to rotate passwords based upon like users and compromises?
Absolutely. So in addition to folks who are actually leveraging CyberArk itself, also the organizations who create the policies, framework auditors, folks like that, there's actually a large pool of folks that we'll consult with in terms of generating our baseline recommendations. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of times will come in because there's been either A, re-up of compliance, B, an audit. Now there's a lot of best practices too, but those help us establish a baseline that we can then create additional security on top of for sure. And I saw two more, yes.
I have a follow-up question to that. So one of the reasons I see organizations rotating passwords is because they, on the IT side, have a on-call administration model, or on the DevOps side are following the sheriff pattern, where only one DevOps guy should have that SA at any one point in time, or only one admin should have access to that DA at any given time. And then they rotate the password when that session ends, right? So they're on call for a week, they have access for a week.
Sure.
So my question to you is this: on the providing of credentials, does CyberArk incorporate or support scheduling? So we got 12 people in here, I have access to the password this week, next week Zoe has access, and so on down the line.
Absolutely. There are a couple of different models that we look at this. The first is simply giving users access to that secret based upon, say, limited access group membership. But it can extend to Zoe being able to use that password for a week, and only Zoe. Once the password is checked back in again, a rotation is triggered automatically. This extends to where maybe the check-in occurs, but the password change can't happen until 2 a.m. on Thursday, so maintenance windows too.
Oh, beauty.
But in cases where users need to see that password, it needs to hit their eyes, yes, we want to make sure we're scheduling and doing things like exclusive access, especially when we're dealing with built-ins. For instance, if you have access to the built-in administrative account on the system at 1.2.3.4, my local logs will say, oh, admin did this. Well, who was admin at that time? Well, it was Brandon, for instance. So yes, that's something we want to do. But to extend that, my goal, my nirvana state, is for those same users to never see what the password is. And we'll expand on that idea here in the next couple of minutes for sure. Yes?
Could you speak to organizations that might have an internal Radius server and whether or not your product would complement that?
It will, and it should. If we're using an internal Radius server, are you speaking like TACACS or ACS specifically, or just in general?
Yeah, so like pretend there's a network switch and it's got a root or admin account that your product could manage over SSH. But I've already provisioned access to that switch via Radius and Active Directory groups.
Yeah.
So would your products just manage the root account essentially at that point, or
Or
you integrate
enable,
with
for
Radius?
instance. Yeah, definitely. So when we look at kind of the two layers of access, we've got the users that are probably authenticating through Radius or the ACS server using their standard accounts. In many cases, part of phase one is not to manage a user's standard account. Those, if done properly, are typically least privileged, and then they elevate to whatever privileged account we're dealing with, root or enable or sysdb or whatever it may be. So our goal, at least in phase one, is to manage those, place the authentication into CyberArk behind that strong Radius or multi-factor solution so that even for the shared accounts, you've now got multi-factor being inherited. So we do see it being a complement, but when we're dealing with kind of low-level accounts that are using multi-factor, a lot of times in phase one, even phase 2 or 3, we don't change that if these are least privileged accounts. Now, if they do have privilege, it's a different story.
You could scope Radius to a privileged group, an AD, for instance.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And the same would be true for us. So for instance, a lot of companies are using multiple levels of multi-factor. So certain groups may be leveraging Radius, other groups may be performing federation, some groups might have grid cards. For those of you who may have never seen a grid card, it's like security bingo. So you, to log in, you have to enter the number in B1, C9, D8, and then bingo. But different groups might have different requirements. We want to make sure that we're respecting that when you're logging into the CyberArk platform too.
And can you incorporate some of the same type of principles on that for when you have certificate-based type authentication to switches and routers and stuff along those?
802.11x type stuff.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And our goal is we want to be able to inherit the multi-factor that you're leveraging today, not supplant it, not replace it. And this is one of the reasons why all those partnerships that you may have seen at CyberArk, we want to do it protocol-based too. So for instance, if a certificate is passed for authentication and CyberArk needs to communicate with the appropriate authority, then that's done at protocol layer, not specifically at vendor integration layer. Well, thank you for the question.
Sure.
So first state, user logs in, checks out a password, they use it. On the back end, we're rotating it based on a policy that's been specified. As complex as you want to. 85 characters long, with half of those being special characters. It's okay, doesn't matter to us, as long as the system accepts all those characters. Now, in many cases, like with databases, we don't allow you to pass semicolons. It's for good reason, so we can handle those forbidden characters too, so we're not dropping production databases. Connection happens, user's happy, life is good. But let's expand on that idea. When you're using a vault, it's pretty important for that vault to be secure. Right? If it's just a system hanging out there with a database that anybody could access all day long, you've actually made yourself worse than having passwords existing in the minds of your users. So for us, security is and must be uncompromising. Our vault itself, the cornerstone, and we operate in a hub and spoke type architecture, so the vault's only job is storing secrets. But this vault itself is hardened with a number of different security layers, some of which you're seeing here. Within that vault, we have these logical containers called safes. Safes are what is our element of role-based access. In a safe, you have multiple objects, credentials, files, secrets, grandma's cookie recipe, whatever you choose to store inside that safe. And one of my favorite parts of the solution itself is a hierarchical encryption model. Each of those objects, those thingies in a safe, are encrypted. The safes themselves also have an encryption key. The vault itself also has a baseline encryption key too. Server, safe, and object. So every access within CyberArk requires 3 decryption challenges to occur. We design it this way to help with brute forcing. Now, CyberArk does not store these secrets inside of a database. It's a proprietary flat file system. We do have a database for storing metadata and facilitating fast replication. It is self-managed. DBAs do not need to access it. We simply do not want them accessing the vault itself. But there is that server key, right? The kind of the base of the encryption stack. Now you can store it in memory, right? When the vault starts, it's hanging out there in memory. What most of our customers use, if they have access to a PKCS 11 compliant hardware security module, is they'll store the key there to offload, encrypt, decrypt operations. And we've got partners like Gemalto, Talus, but like I said, any PKCS 11 will work there. Now, the Vault, if you're into that, was originally designed to exceed Microsoft's SSLF recommendations for high security, low functionality Bastion servers. We've added a number of other elements to the Vault platform too. So Vault security, absolutely key. The Vault should be locked down. The Vault should be an island of security. And you'll see that as more of the architecture a little bit later. So users can check out passwords, but they see those passwords. And if you're anything like me, when you see a password, the first thing you do is you write it down. And then you put it on a sticky note, and that sticky note goes under the keyboard, or you give it to someone, that someone takes it, sells it on the darknet, bad things happen. So for me, being able to connect a user without showing them that secret is a security benefit. It's also an access benefit too, because who likes to copy and paste passwords? It's kind of old school. We shouldn't need to do it. So what CyberArk has done is we've created a process, we call it privileged session management, that allows for a user to log in through the browser or using their own tools, modify their connection string, identify themselves, pull down that secret, and then connect. And the secret transfer happens inside of CyberArk, so it never reaches the end user's system. So all the creepy stuff out there can't get access to the credential. So it goes through the process, session is isolated. We launch whatever client the user cares about, whatever you've configured. So things like SQL Server Management Studio, PuTTY, RDP, Secure CRT, Toad, a crusty old mainframe emulator, for instance, or a built-in one, as a browser, for instance, to a web client too. As long as it can be driven programmatically, it can be launched through CyberArk. As an added artifact of this, we're monitoring everything that users are doing. Video, keystrokes, as well as Windows title captures, all coming back. So we can take those shared accounts I mentioned earlier and say, well, Brandon was the one who did stuff with that shared account. We can also apply analytics to this too, and I'll talk about that in a later session. But connecting users by leveraging their own native tools, or the browser, but mostly the own native tools, it's a pretty happy state. But there's still something missing there. What if it's a browser-based connection? That would mean a user would have to launch some connection aggregator to then connect through, and then CyberArk internally would programmatically launch a browser. That's not very native, is it? It's more native on the PuTTY side, the RDP side, but for browser stuff, things like AWS, Twitter, Salesforce, LinkedIn, CyberArk has recently created something new, relatively new. We call it Privileged Session Management for Cloud, where a user can open up the same browser window they would to log into the client, so we exist as either an explicit or a reverse proxy here, will intercept the authentication, check out the secret from the vault if we choose to have it vaulted or use it as just kind of a jump, and then connect the user to whatever endpoint that is. Frictionless connectivity while instantiating security should be the goal for every company. Yes?
So do you have a mechanism for identifying and detecting and then managing and changing passwords for assets that people may not even be aware of? Like Intel AMT is admin, you know, and how many people knew they were running that until they were compromised?
Absolutely. So there is kind of two areas to look at it. There's the programmatic discovery that can be done as part of the core platform itself. But the downside there is you actually have to deploy CyberArk to do that discovery. So later on, I'll talk about a free discovery tool we have called DNA, or Discovery and Audit, that allows you to perform those scans well in advance of a project and mitigate risk immediately. So yes, we want to be sure we're reaching out programmatically to find the built-in accounts as well as accounts that we just hadn't thought of, partially because the accounts may have been there longer than our security team, for sure. Yes.
On this slide, are you using a TLS intercept and then to manage the credentials in a browser?
So in this case, what's happening is our proxy is simply existing and filtering the web traffic. So it's just like using any external proxy.
Right,
the web traffic is being filtered. We're then pulling it down based on rules on the back end.
Do you need a hardware device on your premises to do that, or? And the secondary question is, you obviously need to put certificates on the endpoints, right?
Yes. Okay. So there is an element of certificate trust here. Typically, our customers will use their own internal signing CA, but any trust can be built there. And yes, this does require an OVA, so just a virtual appliance that exists either A, on-prem, or B, in a mutually accessible network location, so in the cloud, wherever it may fit.
Okay.
Are you planning, are you doing only inspection on the HTTPS or also about other protocols?
Yep, great question. For this example here, it is HTTPS inspection. The goal is to increase that to other protocols, but we want to make sure we're keeping the focus on privileged account access for specific tool sets and not serving as a full-on, say, web application or user access proxy, as there are a number of other folks out there that will do that for a wider scale. So we want to make sure we're focusing down in on the stuff that has the most rights and access.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, back to the OPA, right, that you're instantiating for the proxy. Does that mean that this solution would only work for internal users? How do you support people who are working from home, work from a coffee shop?
Road warriors.
Yep, so road warriors. So if we've got the proxy that's only proxying traffic through on-prem, so we're not using a VPN or anything like that, then this would only work for people who are connected to that network. When we're dealing with road warriors, we do have options for leveraging DMZ-based communication, external VPNs, as well as other aspects of our solution. So this isn't the be-all, end-all of proxying. I might have a user who may connect in using, say, an HTML5 gateway in order to get access through the same console. They might use the more kind of video bastion-based connection than this more native flow. But there are options there depending on how our external users are connecting in. However, we do assume that they'll be able to access through network some element of the solution. Now, if we go super, super far into the more kind of aggressive layer of security, you may set up the traffic for, say, that login to only go through the CyberArk approach. In that sense, the user must gain access through, and by nature of not knowing their secrets, they won't be able to access the solution within. So one of the biggest controls we can kind of provide, not being malicious with controls, but if a user doesn't know a password, that means they simply must go through the prescribed connection process that we've set out as a security best practices.
So talk about high availability, reliability.
Sure.
If it fails, fail open, fail close, or what happens when the entire farm decides to die on you at that point?
Great question. Now I will address this more a little bit later in terms of how we look at failover, but if we simply have one CyberArk node and that one CyberArk node goes down, well, we may as well go home for the day. So we want to be sure that no matter what, we're instantiating good redundancy. And it's one of the things we include as part of our platform. There's not like, oh, well, you can go out and buy an extra layer of redundancy. We want to make sure that the core, the stuff that matters, is there and available for users, regardless of network connectivity issues at the DC, a whole DC being down, all the way up till the sun explodes, in which case we have other issues at that point. So I will talk more about redundancy in a bit for sure. Yes?
You guys have a TLS 1.3 plan?
We do, yes, absolutely. As it stands today, internally within CyberArk, we use a proprietary protocol. That, however, can be moved to TLS. We're also making sure that our R&D is porting that and making sure we have best practices around TLS 1.3 switchover.
Even for your intercept proxy?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, for us, we follow two things. Number one, security best practices in general. But number two, what our customers are doing, what they're adopting. We have to make sure that, yes, if we're on the forefront, we're also able to support customers that may not have met that with our recommendations. It's one of the reasons why, for instance, for our SSH key management, I will all day long not recommend you to use DSA formatted keys. But in some areas, it has to be used. So at the very least, we want to be sure to rotate aggressively and provide strong key links there. So yes, the short answer to the question. So for me, this is better. But most importantly, of all these different options, they're just that. They're options. We're being sure that no matter what the workflow might be, we've got a mechanism to connect users that's as close to how they normally do things. Now, a lot of this you may be thinking on-prem. Now, with the cloud proxy, you may be thinking some cloud stuff too. And I talked about the breach flow in the previous session, but if we look at compromise, old school way is to do that land and expand, right? Fish a user, get internal, move laterally, compromise. However, with more and more infrastructure existing as a service, that's one stop. Now, I have a confession to make. If you haven't noticed, I am a millennial. I'm proud of being a millennial, but I am one. And the thing about millennials is that folks will tend to, there's a word for it, when you don't want to do more than is required, when you want to do the least amount of steps, there's some word, efficient. I'm also the face of the threat actors too. We're efficient, not lazy. I know some of you are thinking lazy. It's not lazy, it's efficient. But as a threat actor, if I simply need to compromise one level and I can do it from the comfort of my own home, apartment, mother's basement, wherever it may be, of course I'm going to choose that mechanism. It's because of the more public-facing element of infrastructure as a service, we're seeing a lot more compromises take advantage of this. And CyberArk has a red team. We do a number of engagements, both internal and external, and we've seen this flow play out in a number of different cases, where we're able to compromise an end user, then on their desktop, I kid you not, there are flat files that say access key. Remember a decade ago when people store passwords in text files and they stopped doing that? Well, now we're seeing the same thing with privileged access keys. By leveraging this access key, we were able to connect the end user's storage to our AWS instance and found PII. This happened over the course of 3 to 5 hours. 3 hours is all it took to perform the compromise. So we want to make sure that we also are managing human and non-human access in the cloud too. It's one of the reasons why you see some of those improvements previously. Now, last part I'll mention before moving into a demonstration here is the general architecture of the solution itself. Now, I won't go too in-depth, but it starts with a vault. Multiple vaults, maybe, not just one vault. If that vault goes down, you want to have redundancy. Now, whether you choose to cluster those vaults like you've seen here or do single nodes, we want to make sure we've got elements of failover. This exists as what we call a disaster recovery vault, which is becoming a distributed vault as we enable more services. For this, we could have a DR vault or DR cluster in another data center, or 3 data centers, or 5 data centers, or one that exists in AWS or Azure with a core existing on-prem. That DR vault is replicating the primary constantly. So synchronous and asynchronous replication. Synchronous for little things, password changes, audits, stuff like that. Asynchronous for large things like sessions that are recording. If my primary vault should go down or the DR vault loses connection, after a period of retries, interval between, we automatically perform failover. Now, RTO between clustering and DR, fairly similar. So most of the time, we'll see clustering for local-based availability, but also if there's like a corporate requirement to have a cluster in the environment. Again, have multiple vault nodes so that should all the infrastructure go down, we still have some vault. And if all of your active infrastructure goes down, make backups, full, incremental, as many as you'd like to. Now, outside of the vault itself is where our distributed components live. So these are the spokes of that hub and spoke weird kind of model I mentioned earlier. It's weird because I describe it in a weird way. Things like the user portal. Have as many as it makes sense. Load balance them, make them available. The jump servers, place them close to devices, place them in the cloud. The piece that changes passwords. All these things should be placed into those partially air-gapped environments, into the environment of a company that was based on an acquisition, without having to open up firewall Swiss cheese all over the place from your centralized vault. While we design this for things like ICS networks and mountainous ones, it's really come in handy when dealing with more and more hybrid-based approaches in the cloud, stuff like that. And while this is one of everything, a more common deployment strategy is something that looks like this, where we have a core, stuff existing in a primary data center, maybe a cloud DC, maybe a distributed one, whatever fits. We want to make sure we've got redundant models that can live out there too. And also, more importantly, users should not experience that weird stomach cramp when they can't access their stuff. So it's not just business continuity, it's also keeping our users happy, productive too, because the time it takes someone to send you an email to let you know it's down is time well spent doing other things, actually being productive to the companies we work for.
I have a question,
yeah, please.
actually. I've worked in the past with ultra-high profile, high net worth individuals, etc. And when things like this, when they're remote employees or they're people that work for them are remote and they're traveling, is there any like things that you can do? Like, you know how 1Password has that thing where like when you're traveling, you can put it in like traveling mode so you can't actually access anything? Is there like a quick turn it in travel mode and it can turn off quickly? Or do you have to manually remove permission to have access to all of these things and then re-add it after? Like, is that all manual, or can you do like timelines, if that makes sense?
Good question. So there isn't a concept of a travel mode within CyberArk. Our assumption is if a user is able to connect into the appropriate environment, they should really be able to access their secrets. However, this is implicit on the fact that they've authenticated into CyberArk appropriately, that their multi-factor is working there and in the correct group, stuff like that.
Could you do like an emergency turn off, like that joke where you've got like the switch that you can like cut the network cable? But do you have like something like that where you can just shut down somebody's account really quickly, or is it?
Absolutely. So that can be done in either based on approvals, like an emergency button, but it's most commonly done through a disabling of the Active Directory user or removal from the group. The same corporate policy that you would do if you had a rogue employee will also cut their access into the CyberArk platform.
Okay, that makes sense.
And this extends to like if you're using like an identity management platform like RSA VIA or a SailPoint, it's also the same thing, right? As soon as you remove their access, it then ripples down into removing access to CyberArk too.
Do you have any limitation? I guess, is it still based on like the way that I guess that makes sense. Is like a locational, like a. Do you know how in Splunk you can like if you log in at this time at this place and then you log in at this time at this place as well? Does it track those sort of things as well?
Absolutely. We look at that as a trusted network area, for instance. If a user exists outside of the trusted network area, no authentication can occur.
Oh, nice.
It's also an element that we apply analytics on top of too. So if Brandon logs in Monday through Friday from 9 to 5 and then logs in at 4 a.m., that's weird. It's an anomaly. I should be able to notify you.
I always set those off actually, but no, that makes
Night
sense.
owls. But the thing is, that as you do it, it builds a behavioral baseline.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
eventually, your 4 a.m. night owl work is okay until you start trying to say check out thousands of passwords at once. That's also weird.
Do you also have like an ability to capture his metrics and like present them to kind of both the technical team, but also another version you can present to like high level?
Yes.
Yeah. And then the other question I had was, I can't remember it right now. I'll think of it and I'll ask you again. Sorry.
I've
Cool,
got
yeah,
just
please
one
let
last
me know.
question that falls in the same vein we were discussing before as well, is do you have any kind of function of like a vault export? Because I've been in this situation before. It's like, we have our passwords, great. We need to write these down and place them physically in a vault, which sounds all fine. Like, you don't need to do that. It's great until
You do.
all the protection mechanisms you have in place are great, and then they all lost, and the entire system's down because various ways we can shut the whole credentialing system down, and now you can't get into it to fix it because you don't know the password.
A break glass for your break glass. So in cases like that, and this is maybe a little bit of a Brandon adage, but in cases where everything is down, all of our redundancy fails, we are just up the creek. The one credential that CyberArk isn't managing is the one that isn't in CyberArk. So don't yell at me yet. Don't throw things at me yet. But when we pull in a number of these secrets, we begin automatic rotation. It frees us up on an oversight side of things. So I can have, say, a domain administrative credential that exists outside of CyberArk that I can then perform manual rotation operations on. Yes, it exists inside of a vault, but if it's being used out of band, it's leaving hashes too. So I want to be sure that, yes, if I'm going to do break glass, I have this other secret in the vault, but I'm updating it. And that's what people will typically throw things at. I mean, I have to go to the vault, open it, and then add a new account. Yes, you probably should. The same is true, say, for the CyberArk master account too. There will be accounts that exist outside for break glass scenarios. Please put them in a safe, put them in a secure location, but also change them.
But is there an easy way to export out the vault as it stands?
Yes, absolutely. So there is an export process. While it's not something we see very often, it is certainly possible to export the data in the vault, yes.
I ask just because I have had literal vaults I have to place the passwords into, and it's sucked handwriting out 100-character passwords because it has to be handwritten on carbon paper. And stuff.
Yep. So when we do our deployments for our master password, I don't know if we do the pomp and circumstance anymore, but it used to be where we would have users generate separate strings. We would then provide it to the CyberArk engineer who would order them in a certain way, put them into an envelope, and like do this whole ceremony where we present it and put it in the safe. So the same is true there. But just not 100 characters on one sheet of paper. That is, well, I would probably mess it up because my handwriting is awful. But okay, excellent point. Sorry.
I was asking about that envelope ceremony because I know some of your competitors offer that, and to me, as an IT pro, that's really attractive because I can take that symbol, hand it to the business, to legal compliance. They could put it in a safe.
Yep.
They have ultimate control, not me. So. You have something similar to that, okay?
Yes. And while I don't know if it's as much as a ceremony anymore, you can always request it to be a ceremony, and
right.
Definitely do that. Music, lights,
balloons,
ritual.
Tiki torches, probably not tiki torches inside of a building, but yes, it's definitely
that
possible.
bad things.
And did you have a?
Yeah, I had a question. So, stepping back for just a minute, you mentioned SailPoint. I'm assuming that with your integration, you got a lot of automation there. So my question to you is twofold. One, can you talk briefly about what can and what cannot be automated? Sure. And two, can you give like a high-level overview of what the API would look like?
Definitely. So in terms of the API, there are two functions. SailPoint leverages our RESTful administrative API on the backend, as well as our SCIM server to actually pull in data locally to the SailPoint side of things. While the SCIM server is publicly documented, most of our customers will leverage our admin API, and I'll be sure to show it as part of the session here so you can actually see what it looks like. But for the SailPoint side of things, or just really any identity platform, they're pulling in entitlements from CyberArk, so you can see what accounts are privileged, what are managed, what does user access look like. but also using that same API to programmatically vault new privileged identities or entities that are showing up outside of our discovery process too. But it is all based on primarily the admin API that's available to every customer, as well as the SCIM service, which is also available, but this is mostly an element of integration.
Beautiful. And as a follow-up to what Zoe was saying, with that admin API, a lot of my customers are now adopting SOAR, right? I want to orchestrate and automate and everything, blah, blah, blah. So with something perhaps like ServiceNow or ticketing system, could I say, hey, submit a ticket because we notice this malicious behavior, some other instrumentation has alerted, go ahead and perform these actions, disable accounts, rotate passwords?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Now for ServiceNow specifically, as you mentioned, of course, ticket integration there too, but also this extends to managing the secrets they use for their discovery and orchestration. So being sure we're handling it on both sides, but yes, as long as there's an externally facing API, I can tag into them. As long as they have access to our API, they can automate tasks within CyberArk too. Beautiful. It should be that way. Like we need to instantiate more automation so security teams can do other stuff that befits a human.